So projectile is any object which has an initial velocity and then follows a path of a projectile, which is determined entirely by the gravitational force. Meanwhile, projectile motion is now the motion of any object that is projected by any means into the air at a certain angle. This projectile motion can be analyzed by the use of vector notations of vector components. So a projectile can also be described as an object which is again moving on two dimensions, and the two dimension would be the x and the y axis and is influenced by gravity. As you can see here, there's a cannon being fired, and as it moves on both the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension, which you can see here as time passes by, it has its changing velocity y but a constant velocity x. It means that since a projectile moves in two dimensions, it therefore has two components, just like a resultant vector. I hope you can recall what a resultant vector is. Meaning, for example, in this image, if in this point the projectile moves at this direction, we can actually find its x dimension and y dimension, the value of those, the value of x dimension and y dimension, by using our strategy of SOHCAHTOA. Now let's analyze the different dimensions. First, of course, the x dimension or the horizontal dimension. Please remember that the horizontal velocity component of a projectile motion or a projectile object, it never changes. It covers equal displacement, meaning from one position to another. As time goes by, as you can see in this example, per 1 second, it covers the same meters or same meter. This means that the initial horizontal velocity would always be equal to the final horizontal velocity. Meaning here, in this example, this blue arrow here, here, and the last blue arrow, they are not changing. They are constant. Meanwhile, the vertical component or the y component changes because it is now affected by gravity. As you can see in this image, this vector is longer than this vector, and this vector is now longer than this vector because as the projectile moves upward, mas hinihila siya ng gravity. Okay? So it does not cover the equal displacement in a certain period of time. For example here, per 1 second, instead of covering, for example, sa horizontal motion na 1 meter per 1 second, as you can see here, it increases the displacement. In a 1 second interval, you have here 5 meters. In a 1 second interval again, the projectile now reached 20 meters. So let's combine those concepts. Combining those concepts, we now have here that the component of a projectile motion, which can be divided into the horizontal and vertical, if we try to look at the magnitude, the magnitude of the horizontal component will be constant. Again, if this value is 5 meters per second, this will be 5 meters per second, this will be 5 meters per second, and the last horizontal component will still be 5 meters per second. The direction now would be, of course, still constant. How about its vertical components? Its vertical components will change. Again, why? Because gravity affects the vertical component. Again, the vertical component will change. Why? Because gravity is acting on the vertical component. So, the magnitude and the direction, So the magnitude and the direction will both change through time. Together, if we try to combine this projectile, the x and y components, it will produce a certain path, and that path, we call that the trajectory. This path will be parabolic in nature as a result of the interactions between the x and y components. If we now try to horizontally launch a projectile, as you can see here in this image, when we say projectile which are horizontally launched, we mean they have no upward trajectory and no initial when we say horizontally launched projectile, we mean projectiles which have no upward trajectory and no initial vertical velocity. As you can see here in this image, it will start with an initial y velocity of 0 meters per second. Meanwhile, its x component would be constant, meaning the value for this one would still be the value at the end. Let's now try to recap or summarize what do we mean when we say projectile motion. A projectile is any object upon which the only force acting would be gravity. Projectiles travel with a parabolic trajectory due to the influence of gravity. There are no horizontal forces acting upon projectile and thus no horizontal acceleration. The horizontal velocity of a projectile would be constant throughout the situation. There is a vertical acceleration which is caused by gravity. The horizontal motion of a projectile is independent of its vertical motion. Ibig sabihin po nun, walang pakialam yung horizontal motion sa vertical motion. Okay? So they won't try to affect each other